Thanks so much for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you're a Wild Health patient, you might not know, but you have access to our referral program. This gets your friends and family 25% off Wild Health services. Just head to Clarity, and in the top right corner, you'll see Refer a Friend. Click there, and you'll be brought to a page with your referral code. Happy sharing.
We're already laughing and we haven't started yet.
Yeah, we're laughing about the things we can't talk about on air.
Yeah. Well, this is take two for us because we started giggling like schoolboys. But really excited to have my distant acquaintance, Matt Dawson, and our company's CEO on the podcast. Welcome back, Matt.
Thanks, Mike. Excited to be here.
All right. So this is from a listener question, and I thought it'd be fun to do kind of a deep dive on this. You know how the media likes to just pick up on any sort of clickbaity health and nutrition topic and make it into a big deal? You ever seen that happen?
I've seen that happen.
Yeah. Seems like coffee's good for you, coffee's bad for you, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. It doesn't really matter what the topic is. Today's topic is on red meat, and this has definitely swung both ways in terms of whether red meat is a quote-unquote health food or an unhealthy food. And specifically, the question was about whether red meat is pro-inflammatory, whether it leads to increased systemic inflammation. And we'll dive into some of the evidence here. But before we dive in, can you give us just your quick take on why managing inflammation is important?
Sure. So I think I said sure because I was actually thinking about something else other than that question specifically just asked, which is you mentioned, is red meat good for you or bad for you? But then you said we're going to be answering the question, is it pro-inflammatory? Which I just want to kind of point out isn't necessarily the same
Oh,
thing.
for sure.
And so I know you know this, but for the listeners, inflammation. So is red meat pro-inflammatory? We will dive into that question, but I don't think by diving into that question, we specifically answer the question, should you eat red meat or not? So maybe we will hint at that, but I do want to answer that specific question that someone sent in. Just to go a little further down that rabbit hole, is exercise pro-inflammatory? Yes. But does it mean that exercise is bad for you? No. So inflammation can be a hormetic. You can have a hormetic response to that and actually get better from it. Usually with foods, it's not. So usually if food is inflammatory, that's not a good thing. So since we're talking specifically about inflammation, though, I do want to make that point and point it out. It could be that red meat is pro-inflammatory, and it could be that it's still healthy to eat because there's usually multiple benefits and multiple costs to something. And you add those up to decide whether to do it or not, and it may depend on different people, different situations, whether it's good or bad for you. But instead of just continuing to go on and on about that and dodging the question, maybe we should talk about, is red meat pro-inflammatory, knowing that that's not necessarily going to answer the question, should you eat red meat or not?
I think that's quite possibly the longest caveat I've ever heard from you. But yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I think what I was really hoping you might talk about when I asked you that question, if I can just answer it myself,
sure.
Is, there's
the answer that you wanted.
I mean, there's acute inflammation and there's chronic inflammation, sure, right? Yeah. And you alluded to exercise as eliciting a hormetic response. So for those of you who only speak English, basically the idea that you're applying an acute stressor and then you're adapting to that stress as you recover. So it's a functional response, and it's going to make us better / maybe stronger, more fit, more cardiovascularly fit in the long run. And I do agree. I think foods are less like foods that regularly contribute to inflammation that you eat regularly are more likely to give you chronic inflammation. And we know that that's a driver of so many of the chronic diseases of aging in the U.S., whether it's diabetes or heart disease or dementia or cancer. So I think that's where the question probably comes from.
Yeah, and sorry for the long caveat, but I think a lot of times the questions we ask are more important than the answers we give. So I just wanted to kind of line that out. We will answer that question, but it is not an indictment on whether meat is good or bad, and we can certainly touch on that at the end and kind of give our thoughts and opinions on that. But tell me about it, Mike. Like, is red meat pro-inflammatory, and how do you know?
Yeah, so it depends. Is the answer to, is red meat pro-inflammatory? Like most answers that we give around nutritional advice or most things health related, we're obviously, for listeners of the podcast for a long time, we're very focused on delivering recommendations and guidance for an individual and not for a population. So I can start right off with one that's individual related, and that's folks who have particular genetic dispositions to develop insulin resistance and abnormal lipids in the setting of a diet that's high in saturated fat. So those are, specific single nucleotide polymorphisms or genes that can contribute to that risk. In those folks, if you're eating fattier cuts of meat, like a ribeye or something similar, and they're very sensitive to the amount of saturated fat in their diet, that is known, the saturated fat intake in those patients is known to increase dyslipidemia or elevated cholesterol and insulin resistance, both of which can increase inflammation and increase that as measured by something like C-reactive protein.
Yeah, this was one of the really interesting early aha moments for Mike Mallon and I when we started doing this, is seeing how he responds to saturated fats versus me. I do not get any inflammation. My CRP stays really low on a lot of saturated fat and animal meats, and Mike's inflammation does spike on it. And it's interesting, we've seen this in patients sometimes too, who will get spikes on their CGM from meat, which should not be the case. You wouldn't think about it. You think about just carbs and glucose spiking at CGM, but an inflammatory response. We've probably all seen this if we've worn CGMs when it comes to stress or other specific things like that. And meat, for some people, it seems like can be a stressor and lead to a little bit of inflammation.
Yeah, that's super dependent on your genetics. And as you mentioned, right, I mean, I have plenty of patients who can tolerate saturated fat ad libitum, right, as much as they want. They can go on a low carb, high fat diet. They can go on a full ketogenic diet, and they do great from their lipid profiles. And then others who can literally have, a waiter carry a ribeye past them and their lipids go up. And I think that's me. I have those genetics. All right. Advanced glycation end products, so AGEs. This was in the news a bunch, it feels like about a decade ago, was cooking red meat, especially at high temperatures, can result in the formation of AGEs, which are thought to contribute to inflammation and oxidative stress. So talk to me about, charring your meat on the grill.
Yeah, I don't do it. I remember when I first started reading some of this literature. It's not super, like any nutritional literature, it's not necessarily super convincing as to what it does to you, but I don't think it's good. You may have heard of kind of these heterocyclic amines as well. So it's from cooking meat. It's a reaction between some of the amino acids and creatine. And some people really like the charred flavor. Some people don't. Even if you like it, it's probably a lot more risk than potential reward of the little bit better taste to you. So how you cook the meat does matter, I think. There's safer ways to cook it. Just don't burn it, I think is the message.
Yeah, don't eat the charred stuff. All right, arachidonic acid. So this is a fatty acid found in higher quantities in red meat as compared to other types of meat. And arachidonic acid just sounds like it would be inflammatory. It serves as a precursor to various inflammatory mediators. Does that really translate into meat being pro-inflammatory? Well, we're going to get there, but that's one mechanism by which it has been postulated that red meat can increase inflammation. Let's talk about TMAO. So trimethylamine N oxide, or TMAO. Gut bacteria will metabolize certain components found in red meat like carnitine and choline, and this can produce TMA as a byproduct, and then our livers convert that TMA into TMAO. We do know that elevated levels of TMAO have been associated with inflammation as well as an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So what's your take on that? You got somebody with a high TMAO level consuming a lot of red meat. Do you think that'd be an area you'd want to push on, or you'd look at other possibilities?
I don't know. I don't have a really strong grasp of the literature when it comes to this. I've seen the associations. I know a lot of people talk about it. There's probably something there. I think if someone is worried about the TMAO level, and we can talk about another strategy to get their protein intake through other sources, then great. Like if we can lower that, I think it's probably better if it's lower than higher. I just don't know the magnitude of the difference. And so, sure, if we're not causing harm by someone not getting enough protein, and then get it at other sources, and we can lower TMAO, I say go for it.
Yeah, the one thing I'd add there on the pro meat side, or the anti-demonization of red meat side, is I have plenty of patients who eat lots of red meat who have normal TMAO levels, and there's also a lot of there's a lot of TMAO production associated with shellfish, fish, other forms of animal protein. So this is not, while this is one other mechanism by which red meat consumption could increase your risk for inflammation, I don't think it's red meat specific.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I forgot about that when I was really looking at the TMAO literature several years ago. And to be quite frank, I didn't go super deep. I just remember one of the things that really increased it was fish. And I just remember thinking, we know about all the other benefits of fish. So I'm just not sure how much I'm going to pay attention to this. I could certainly be convinced. This isn't something I feel strongly about, but I'm not super convinced this is something that I'm going to push on super hard.
Yeah, and personally, I mean, I don't have evidence to back this up, so caveat for me here, but I think, just seeing the number of folks who eat plenty, who eat lunch like you, right? Like 2 tins of canned fish, or who eat salmon 4 or 5 days a week and have normal TMAO levels versus those that eat the same and have high TMAO levels. It's either, microbiome or genomics. Again, it's going to depend patient to patient, because there's plenty of people who eat fish regularly, eat red meat regularly, have normal levels, and then other ones who have elevated ones. So I think it's certainly more complex than just red meat increases your TMAO, and therefore you should avoid that because it's pro-inflammatory. That would not be my summary on TMAO.
Yeah, I think another important component to meat, is it pro-inflammatory or not, or just is it good for you or not, has to do with the quality and the type of meat. So obviously extremely processed meats can have a lot of nitrates, a lot of extra sodium and salt and other processed chemicals in them. So you want to avoid that. Also, just meat and where it came from. If there's a lot of hormones and antibiotics, industrial farming practices, there's going to be negative effects on that. Now, are those hormones and antibiotics pro-inflammatory, or the sodium stuff pro-inflammatory? I'm not sure. It's just not good for you.
Yeah, and I think we saw I think probably overblown sensationalism around processed meats and risk of colon cancer, where there is a relative risk increase, but it's quite small, and a very small absolute risk increase. But I do think if you're going for ultra processed anything, we're probably going to be kind of trying to gently guide you away from that. So I think, why not apply that to the kind of meat that you're eating?
So we've talked about some of the things to avoid. Saturated fats may be inflammatory for some people, depending on their genetics and other factors. Advanced glycation end products we want to avoid. Arachidonic acid can be a precursor to inflammatory mediators. TMAO could be a problem. Hormones, antibiotics, processed meat could be an issue. You want to talk about kind of the good side and maybe where meat is potentially even anti-inflammatory? Is there an argument to be made there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's a good segue from knowing where your meat comes from and your point around hormones and antibiotics. Probably the biggest thing to me in terms of sourcing there, beyond making sure you're not getting meat that's been pumped full of hormones and antibiotics, or maybe at the same level of importance, is grain-fed versus grass-fed. So some studies suggest that meat from animals that are grain-fed contains a less favorable ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, which can certainly contribute to inflammation. Findings suggest that grass-fed beef could exert protective effects against a number of diseases, ranging from cardiovascular disease to cancer, as evidenced by more functional omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids and decreased saturated fatty acids. So nice study fatty acid composition of grain and grass-fed beef and their nutritional value and health implication. And that's been, we'll go ahead and put a link to that in the show notes, but that's something right there that, grass-fed beef, high omega-3 ratio, low in saturated fat, may very well be anti-inflammatory food given the omega-3 fatty acids that are present. This one's less of a pro-inflammatory, but more of a, hey, just be cautious with data. So many of these observational studies that have shown a correlation between a lot of consumption of red meat and inflammatory diseases and inflammation and diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and certain types of cancer. They're associative studies, right? Correlation does not prove causation. And people who consume large amounts of red meat might also engage in other behaviors that contribute to inflammation, like lack of exercise, sedentary lifestyle, a high consumption of processed foods, lots of processed meats, smoking cigarettes, who knows? So, just because the two are found together does not mean there's a causal relationship. On the pro side, for just why red meat might be valuable and a healthy food for you, it's a great source of nutrients like zinc, selenium, B vitamins, which we know are essential for immune function and may have anti-inflammatory effects to relate to the conversation around inflammation. And B12, for example, right? If you're vegan, this is something you need to supplement because you're not getting it from your food, and meat's an excellent source of B12. What else? Lean meat studies. So research focusing on lean red meat cuts has found really little to no impact on inflammation markers like CRP. So great study entitled Influence of Weight Reduction and Enhanced Protein Intake on Biomarkers of Inflammation in Older Adults with Obesity. So just as the title suggests, this was the Measure Up trial. Just as the title suggests, they took obese older adults. They gave them, there was a control group just having their normal protein, and then there was a group eating lean protein from red meat, and they looked at inflammation. And the findings showed that a weight loss diet with enhanced protein intake compared to an adequate protein diet in terms of weight loss success, and that it leads to improvements in inflammatory status. So specifically, adiponectin, leptin, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and ICAM1. So they actually looked at markers of inflammation, and they found that a high lean meat protein diet actually reduced those markers. So in case we weren't already confused about whether it's pro or anti-inflammatory, here's a pretty clear study showing anti-inflammatory effects of lean red meat consumption.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You may know more about the study. If you were just on the face of it, it would make me ask the question, is it because they're eating less of things that are inflammatory because they're eating the meat? Because a lot of the things that you would eat instead of meat, gluten, dairy, sugar, other processed foods, wheat, are probably going to be pretty inflammatory. So it may be that, again, in my mind, meat is not necessarily, I don't think of it as an anti-inflammatory thing like curcumin or something like that, but it certainly is less inflammatory than most foods that we eat. So that could be an issue when you're thinking about it as anti-inflammatory versus pro-inflammatory. Compared to what, I think, is a question to ask.
Yeah, I think it's a great point about the general quality of evidence with any of these nutritional studies. At least this one was a control group and a study group, and it was prospective. But most of these studies, they're not putting somebody in a metabolic ward in a hospital and supervising exactly what they eat, exactly how many macros, how many calories. And, unless these people are filling out really comprehensive food journals throughout the study, which I don't believe they did in this study, we don't know, hey, did I, put down the Pringles and the other processed foods because I was not hungry because I've been eating more red meat, which is a totally possible mechanism for reducing inflammation. When we're looking at generally suboptimal data quality for these kinds of studies, one of the places we turn is to systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So there are some systematic reviews and meta-analyses done on the topic of inflammation and chronic disease and red meat consumption, as you would imagine. And several of them have concluded that there's insufficient evidence to establish red meat as a risk factor for inflammation or chronic disease when consumed in moderation. Nice study, effects of total red meat intake on glycemic control and inflammatory biomarkers, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and basically pretty high quality studies they included. And they said total red meat consumption for up to 16 weeks does not affect changes in biomarkers of glycemic control or inflammation for adults free of but at risk for cardiometabolic disorders. So that's actually who we're interested in, is people who are at risk of cardiovascular disease or diabetes. And it sounds like you're not, at least for the 4-month study period, having increased red meat consumption did not appear to change your C-reactive protein or your blood sugars. So I think certainly not convincing evidence to say red meat is pro-inflammatory based on the meta-analyses that are out there. And yeah, I mean, I think those are the big topics there. I mean, to me, sourcing is really important. If I'm going to summarize a bit, grass-fed meat products for sure. Probably leaner cuts if you've got an issue with saturated fat metabolism or dyslipidemia. There's plenty of really valuable nutrient content, not to mention the protein content in red meat that makes it really appealing as something you might want to eat. Is it back to our listener question, is red meat pro-inflammatory? You just got exposed to the verbal report of my deep dive. What do you think?
If I had to summarize, I would say that I think you did a good job answering the question, but I still have issue with the question. so after we spent 20 minutes answering it, I think I'll come back to my original point of not to put down this question from someone, but I think what they're actually trying to get at is, should they eat red meat or not? And I think that's a bigger question. I think this is a piece of it, so I think it's fine to answer that piece, but not to get lost in this one thing. I think the bigger question is should we eat red meat or not? And that is like a religious war. That is something that people fight over. And so I'm not going to take a dogmatic view. I will give my opinion on it because I've got the microphone right now. And
I also have a microphone.
So my opinion on it is that when we're talking about what someone should eat, we want them to be appropriately nourished, not overnourished, not undernourished. Are they getting all of the enough protein that they should be getting? Are they getting other micronutrients as well? And in general, let's take the ethical part about it, because some people don't want to eat meat because of sentient beings and those things. Great, like I totally respect that. But let's just remove that for a second to have the nutritional conversation. I think meat can be a really important critical component of a healthy diet. It is the most bioavailable source of protein. It's got a lot of nutrients in it. It also has some downsides for some people who don't process saturated fat. So it's a very individualized thing. I don't think that you're hurting yourself and not going to live a long and fulfilling life if you don't eat meat. Like, I've got no problem with someone not eating meat, but I think if you're not eating meat, it's a little harder. Like, you have to be a little more vigilant about certain things, the B12, the protein, other issues. So I think it can certainly be a very important part of a healthy diet. It's an important part of my diet. My children, I have a couple of daughters who are vegetarian, and I actually try to get them to eat meat because I worry about their adequate protein intake. And it's always like we have to have a certain amount of calories. So when I think about a food and eating it or not, I'm also thinking about what are we eating instead. So if you're not eating meat, where are you getting the rest of your calories? We live in an environment where we got a lot of crap calories around us. And most of the time when I see people eliminate something like meat, they're increasing something else that's usually not better for them than that. So that's just another issue I see with it. But in general, I personally very strongly believe meat can be a very important component of a healthy diet and can improve your nutritional goals. And yeah, I'm a pro-meat person in general.
I knew you were going to take this and just run with pro-meat, anti-meat, instead of just answering the listener question about inflammation. And I'm happy that you did, because it's a more nuanced, right? Just because something's not inflammatory or is inflammatory, which frankly, after doing this dive and discussing it, I think it still depends, right? If you're going for a lean meat that's low in saturated fat, high in omegas, sourced from a grass-fed place that you trust, that doesn't have hormones and antibiotics and hasn't been processed, and you didn't char it and get a whole bunch of AGEs, I think it's probably not inflammatory. I think the literature would support that there's not a significant pro-inflammatory reaction from having that be part of your nutritional approach.
And when I say I'm pro-meat, I'm saying I'm pro-meat for myself. Like, I'm never going to try to get
someone else to eat
meat. But for me, I think it would be difficult for me to get the amount of protein I'm trying to get every day, to get the amount of calories without bringing in other junk calories and things without meat. It's an important part of my diet, at least, and I'm speaking from my my point of view there.
Yeah, and I think, generally, I think our listeners know we're not prescribing any particular advice or damning them for having a different diet that they want to follow. This is all personal. The interesting thing that I just throw out there for thought, and if you have comments on it, would love to hear them, is, you took the ethical thing and sort of said, hey, I'm going to put this over here if it's your ethics that you don't want to, eat a sentient being. And obviously, like, you respect that, and we all respect that, and that's somebody's personal choice. What about the environmental impacts of red meat consumption?
So factory farming is bad for the environment. I think regenerative farming is a way we can actually heal the land and environment. So just like we're talking about, there's good meats and there's bad meats. There's good ways to cook it, bad ways to cook it. There's good ways to farm it and bad ways to farm it. I mean, you look at, there's certain, like the Maui Nui, is that what it's called in Hawaii? The harvesting of those deer, they're actually destroying
the axis
the
deer.
environment. Yeah, so that's an example of people trying to actually repair the environment and harvesting animal protein. Certainly there's bad ways and there's good ways to do it. I think we should, instead of globally saying is it good or bad, it depends on how you do it.
Yeah, 100%. And we see the same thing translating into fishing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, like, we've been recommending smash fish for people for a long time. So salmon, mackerel, anchovy, sardines, and herring. And mackerel just got moved to the non-sustainable list. And hopefully that'll change with, differences in supply and demand and the actual amount of fishing for mackerel. But, in the same way that we're saying those are healthy foods, not healthy for the environment if you're eliminating a species. So, definitely something to keep in mind. All right. Well, thanks for diving into what was potentially going to be a controversial topic for many, but I think this seems like pretty just clear recommendations based on the evidence, and y'all make the decisions that are best for you. But any closing thoughts or words, Matt?
No, thanks for letting me avoid the question at hand and answer the question I wanted to answer.
Anytime. All right. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks so much for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you want more daily health education, be sure to follow us on Instagram, which is filled with health optimization how-tos, grocery shopping lists, guided breathwork posts, myth debunking, and so much more. You can find us at Wild Health MD on Instagram.